This is Midnight Frequency. These are tales from reimagined history, fragments recovered from forgotten archives, stories that may have never happened, yet somehow feel familiar. Tonight's record begins now. You know, we spend so much of our time sifting through forgotten histories, looking at the scraps and notes people leave behind. But every once in a while, you find something in an archive that doesn't just fill in a blank space. It tears a hole right through what we thought we knew.
An impossible object.
Exactly. Something that history insists just doesn't exist, even when you're holding the physical proof that it was right there, living among us.
And that tension, that's really the core of our deep dive today.
Yeah.
This conflict between, hard evidence and just total historical amnesia.
And our source material today is pretty unique.
It is. We aren't just looking at the primary evidence itself, but an analysis of that evidence that was done decades ago. We're working with these really detailed excerpts from a 1950s television script.
A show called The Forgotten Fairy of the Winterborns.
That's the one.
Okay.
It originally aired on a segment called The Forgotten Archives. So the source is itself a historical document about an even older historical mystery.
So we're kind of peeling back layers here. We're looking at a mid-century investigation into this almost unbelievable mystery from the 1920s.
And the mystery is all about a small winged being. The proof, the only reason we even know about her, comes from these fragile 16mm film reels and delicate glass plate photographs.
All recovered from the Winterborn family archives, which have been sealed for decades.
So our mission really is to use this 1950s script to get at two things. First, what does the proof actually show? The specifics. And second, the stunning depth of the denial.
How could a being documented so clearly be completely forgotten by every single person who saw her? That's the paradox we're here to unpack. Okay, let's start with the proof, because I think the credibility of all this really hinges on where it was found.
It does.
These aren't, some questionable snapshots. They were recovered from the sealed, presumed lost archives of the Winterborn family, and these people were incredibly wealthy, old money, and famously reclusive.
And that reclusiveness is critical. It suggests these were private records, not for show. We're dealing with 16mm film, glass plate photos. That's high-end stuff for domestic use in the 1920s.
So this was for them.
Exactly. And the materials were physically sealed away for years. The source makes a point of saying there were just whispers, among old neighbors and staff, but no actual proof until these things turned up in the 50s.
So what do they actually show? The 1950s narration, it sounds like it was very precise.
Oh, very. They confirmed she was no larger than a porcelain doll. And that scale alone, it just forces you to think about the technical skill needed to even capture her on film back then.
Right. Think about focusing a 1920s camera on a moving object that small.
And yet the images are clear. Her wings, they're consistently described as translucent. And the feature makes this really powerful point. This wasn't a still life. In every single frame of the film, she is, and I'm quoting here, undeniably alive.
So she's moving, interactive.
Reacting. A living, breathing, tiny, winged person.
Okay, but given the limits of the technology back then, did the 1950s feature even talk about forgery or staging? Because faking that seems monumental.
They addressed it directly.
Yeah.
And they concluded that the complexity of it all, the sheer amount of footage, the consistency across all these glass plates, the fact that the actual negatives were found locked in a secure vault.
Yeah.
It just argued so strongly against a fake.
So if it was a hoax?
It was a colossal, pointless, and perfectly executed hoax that this whole reclusive family had to be in on. Their working assumption, the one they moved forward with, was that it was authentic. The proof was real.
Which shifts the focus then. If the proof is real, we have to understand her life with them. How did the family even react to this miracle in their own home?
The film suggests a remarkable level of normalization. The source says the Winterborns had quietly accepted her presence. She wasn't the secret they hid in a box.
She was just there. It's part of things.
Right. Integrated into the rhythm of their daily life, but very carefully protected from any wider publicity.
I love the specific examples they found of this. The footage isn't just a portrait of her. It captures her in the middle of their wealthy life.
Exactly. Like, she was filmed perched right on the family's sewing machine.
A totally domestic, ordinary setting.
It connects it to the mundane, right? But then you have the complete opposite, the high society stuff, which is so much more dramatic. The reels show her standing on the polished lid of a grand piano during one of their big evening parties.
Wow. So she's there at their soirees like a tiny sentinel overlooking all these wealthy guests.
Can you just picture that? A whole room of jazz-age socialites, and this little being is just casually on the piano.
It adds this completely surreal quality to the whole Roaring Twenties image. And she's also seen, what, resting on a flower in the garden?
During their summer parties, yes. So she's literally part of their landscape.
And what was her effect on people?
According to the 1950s feature, it was profound. Not just quiet awe. You see children in the film reaching for her with curiosity, but the adults, they just look on with this sort of humbling fascination.
The script called her a beacon of pure joy.
It did, which is a huge statement.
Yeah. And if we're talking about the 1920s, a time of really rigid social classes, deep divisions, the source makes this powerful claim that she actually bridged the gap between classes and races. How does it even support that?
Well, it implies that the shared experience of seeing something so purely wonderful and unexplainable, it created this temporary pause in all the social rules.
How so?
Imagine it. You have a maid, a chauffeur, a cousin, the matriarch, all looking at the same impossible thing at the same time. The source suggests that in that shared moment of awe, their usual barriers just sort of dissolved.
So her just being there created this spontaneous moment of shared wonder that, for a second, overrode all that ingrained prejudice.
Precisely. It suggests her impact wasn't just emotional, it was sociological, at least for that household.
Yeah.
In a time defined by what divided people, she offered this universal point of fascination that went beyond status. The proof suggests she was a constant, quiet, but powerful force in their world.
Okay, so we've established the proof. It's optical, it's authenticated, and it shows she had this real social impact in the 1920s. Now let's get to the mystery, because this is where all logic just fails.
This is the defining contradiction, yes.
How can something so striking, so documented, be so completely and utterly forgotten?
You have the film, which is objective data from, say, 1922, fighting against the entire human story that came after. When the modern heirs finally got into those sealed archives in the 50s, their response was universal.
They knew nothing.
Absolutely nothing about her.
Okay, but that's just generational ignorance. That can happen. But the researchers in the 50s, they dug deeper. They went for the written record.
The diaries.
They looked at the diaries of the matriarchs who were alive, who were hosting those parties when the film was shot. Surely you'd mention the tiny winged person on your piano, right?
You'd absolutely think so. But the diaries, their private, personal thoughts contained not a single word. No name, no reference to a companion, a secret, nothing.
Which implies this wasn't just people forgetting. It suggests a perfect active cover-up or something else.
Something beyond standard human forgetfulness. And the most damning proof of that came from the staff.
The witnesses. The people who ran the house.
Yes, they remembered everything about the Winterbourne household. But when the surviving staff were shown the actual images of the fairy, they draw a blank.
So they remember the room, the piano.
But not her. They remember the environment, the architecture, the family, but the main event, this impossible visitor, was just gone from their memory.
So what did the documentary conclude?
The narrator was left with only one possible summary, and they delivered it with total seriousness. It is a case of mass amnesia. The entire Winterbourne circle collectively forgot a miracle that they had captured on film.
But wait, if the evidence is so compelling, why couldn't the family or staff, when they saw the film in the 1950s, just say, oh my God, I remember now? Was there no spark?
The source says there wasn't. They showed the film to every living person they could find, and while they recognized the furniture, the faces, the fairy herself triggered nothing. They accepted the film was real, but had no memory of its subject.
Which forced them to move beyond normal explanations.
And to explore two really radical theories, which is where we get this incredible split between, perfect human coordination and outright magic.
Okay, let's unpack theory one, the power of human secrecy. The feature suggests the family took a vow of absolute secrecy that was just flawlessly maintained.
This is the denial theory. It says that they knew she was important, maybe dangerous to reveal, and they coordinated a perfect generational silence. But the sheer difficulty of that.
It's staggering.
It would require everyone. Family, estranged cousins, the staff, dozens of guests, over 3 decades, with 0 slips, 0 deathbed confessions, 0 written notes.
It seems, it's possible, but it feels so unlikely. It would require an almost inhuman level of secrecy. Somebody would have written something down, even in code.
It does feel unlikely, and that's what makes the second theory, the magical one, so interesting. Because it doesn't rely on human effort at all.
It relies on the being herself. The source suggests there was a strange property to her magic.
A defense mechanism.
A defense mechanism that lets her be recorded, which is why the film survived, but ensures she is never remembered.
Precisely. If you think about it from a cognitive angle, it suggests her magic specifically targeted subjective human consciousness. But the mechanical recording, the film reel, that's objective data. It was immune.
So every subjective interpretation, every memory, every diary entry was actively wiped clean, or maybe it was prevented from even forming in the first place.
Even as it was happening. So the visual proof survived because it was objective, but the memory failed because it was subjective. This puts the camera, the technology, as the only truly trustworthy witness, more trustworthy than the human mind.
That forces you to really evaluate what counts as evidence, right? When a piece of technology directly contradicts hundreds of living witnesses and all the written records, which do you trust?
The source material really frames her as this living embodiment of that tension between objective reality and subjective experience.
It's a stunning idea. The world saw the winterborn fairy for the very first time in the 1950s through a camera lens, decades after she was filmed with people who, by then, genuinely believed they had never seen her at all.
Her magic, if that's what it was, ensures she exists only in the mechanical record, not in our cultural consciousness. It's a perfect historical vanishing act.
Which brings us to the core takeaway here. The Forgotten Fairy of the Winterborns is just this powerful reminder that history isn't just what we remember or write down. Sometimes the secrets are held by the tech we invent, just waiting in some sealed archive to show us a truth that the people who lived it just couldn't hold on to.
The visual evidence from the 1920s is perfectly clear. The human record, cognitive, written, all of it, is a complete blank. The tension is still there.
And that leaves us with this final provocative thought for you to think about. If a being can be perfectly captured on film but systematically erased from the consciousness and the written record of every person she met, what does that really say about the nature of memory? And can objective truth ever truly survive either a perfect secret or maybe magical interference? Consider which is more powerful in the long run, the image or the memory. This concludes tonight's transmission. The record remains incomplete, as most forgotten stories do. If this story stayed with you, let it rest quietly where memories go before sleep. Until the next frequency.